Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, best wishes to Rome, where you are today focusing on the global food crisis. We all know that time is of the essence, as we are facing multiple crises that broke no delay in being addressed. And it is also clear that we will only be able to deal with these crises by working together, across ministries, across borders, and across sectors. This applies to the ongoing pandemic and its consequences. This applies to the climate crisis and the loss of biodiversity. And this also applies to Russia's criminal war of aggression against Ukraine. Not least due to these crises, we are in many parts of the world now further away than ever from achieving the human right to adequate food. For while the world has finally begun to be proactive in tackling the climate crisis and the loss of biodiversity, Putin has begun using hunger as a weapon for global destabilization. Putin's criminal war against Ukraine is having a considerable impact on the supply of food to the Ukrainian population, and it is also impacting global food security. We have managed to transport far more grain via the so-called EU solidarity corridors, and thanks to the grain agreement facilitated by the United Nations, via the partially reopened Ukrainian Black Sea ports, than anyone would have predicted at the beginning of the war. This has enabled us to tangibly reduce pressure on supply and prices on the global markets, which is particularly benefiting poorer countries that are dependent on wheat deliveries. However, all this is by no means enough, and it is uncertain and very costly. What we need are reliable export routes, and we are taking action with our European partners and with industry to achieve these objectives. These are essential measures in order to give help where humanitarian assistance is urgently needed, particularly in the short term in Ukraine, but also on the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel region, in Afghanistan, and in other regions. For the countries of the global south have already been hit with the full force of the climate and biodiversity crisis. Extreme weather events are becoming increasingly severe and increasingly frequent in these regions, destroying harvests, and consequently also destroying the livelihoods of millions of people. It is furthermore crucial for us to ensure that the climate crisis and the loss of biodiversity do not get any worse. We will only achieve these objectives if we make changes to the agricultural structures across the board, in the respective countries, but also globally. The essential short-term and medium-term emergency aid must be linked to the sustainable transformation of the food systems. This applies especially to the countries that have been hardest hit by the global food crisis. We must support these countries in strengthening domestic agricultural production and in avoiding one-sided import dependencies, so that our food systems become more resilient overall. This means less susceptible to the consequences of the climate crisis and the loss of biodiversity, but also less detrimental to our environment, less susceptible to the impact of the pandemic, and less susceptible to the impact of war, conflict, and unscrupulous attempts at blackmail such as those of the Russian president. Ladies and gentlemen, in view of this, it is important that the state actors do not try and deal with these enormous challenges on their own, but that, as we can see today, the international organizations and civil society, industry and academia from across the world come together to take concerted action. The Committee on World Food Security, with its inclusive multi-stakeholder approach, is therefore a superb forum because it offers the best conditions for developing comprehensive solutions and approaches to global food security. It is essential in this regard that the global governance of agri-food systems has improved and the role of women in particularly strengthened. Germany welcomes the fact that the Committee on World Food Security has devoted itself to these important issues and stand side by side with the EU and its member states. I wish you every success for your meeting today. All the best.